Welcome to the Nieuwe World, thorough conversations in times of change. My name is Durk Kooistra, and today I have with me in the virtual studio Mia Hughes, Director of Genspect Canada. Mia, welcome to our virtual studio. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I introduced you as Director of Genspect Canada. I don't think all of our viewers will know what Genspect is. Could you please shortly introduce the organization and what your role is?
Sure. So Genspect is an international organization founded in 2021 by an Irish psychotherapist called Stella O'Malley. And the organization exists to provide support to families, parents, young people going through gender-related issues, and detransitioners. And the main purpose is to advocate for a non-medical approach to dealing with gender-related distress. Now, I like to always say that Genspect is the antidote to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is an international organization, basically a political activist group that advocates solely for the medical approach, the hormones and the surgeries and everything to the gender-related distress. So Genspect's on one side and WPATH's on the other. I'm the director of Genspect Canada. Genspect has various branches around the world, and I'm the director of Genspect Canada.
Yeah, so you mentioned WPATH, which is the shortening of the could you say it again? The
World Professional Association for Transgender Health. I would like to say that is a misnomer, in that the world no longer follows WPATH. WPATH has been thoroughly discredited, and so it is absolutely not global anymore. Professional, I would not call these people professionals at all. They are extremist activists. And health, they do not promote anything that you could consider to be health. They destroy health. They don't promote it. So it's a misnomer.
And this organization used to be called in a different way, I think, which was, I think the jargon just changed and they didn't want it to be associated with that type of name anymore. I think it had, I watched a talk of you and you talked a lot about DSM, which is a disorder book. And I think the whole thing with the new way of looking at gender is that it's not a disease or a disorder or a syndrome. It's something to be normalized. And in the old name, I think it was referencing to a syndrome or a disorder or a philia. Or could you?
Yeah, let me give you I'll give you a quick history of WPATH. So they were founded in 1978 as the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, HIBIGDA. Now, named after Harry Benjamin, I know it's a terrible, terrible acronym, HIBIGDA, named after Harry Benjamin, who you could say is the godfather, the grandfather of this whole medical scandal. Harry Benjamin, was very active in what I consider to be the second wave of this mad experiment to change the sex of humans. The first wave happened in 1920s, 1930s, Europe, largely Germany, with Magnus Hirschfeld, and they were doing crazy things then. Then it fell out of favor. Then it resurges in the 1950s with Christine Jurgensen, a man who went to Denmark, came back to the US as a blonde bombshell, and it was this huge sensational story. Harry Benjamin was part of that wave two. And he was he saw himself as being on the frontier of a new righteous quest to help all of these poor, tortured souls. And they named, so this is in 1978 when it was a very obscure field of medicine, and nobody understood the origins of this distress. Nobody understood the motivations. And so a very loose affiliation of fringe scientists and sexologists and surgeons get together and they form this professional association, Hibigda. And in the beginning, I do like to think that they were somewhat on a quest to do science, something that looks like real science in a very strange way. But around the late 1980s and through the 1990s, the modern trans rights movement is forming, and it's a political movement. A lot of trans activists are starting to come together, and they have decided that they do not want to be labeled as having a psychiatric disorder. They do not want to be labeled as sexual deviants. They don't want to have a paraphilia or fetish. They decided that they want to be perfectly natural and healthy. And so this group of activists just joins Hibigda. Bit by bit, more and more trans-identified people, trans activists, start to join Hibigda. And from on the inside, they start to shape it. And I'd say from the 1990s onwards, the group's goals are not the pursuit of science. The group's goals become a political quest, and there's some medical, surgical madness going on the side. Now, they rebrand in 2000 and officially in 2006, but they launched 2007. They rebrand as the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They have a trans activist at the helm. It's a woman called Stephen Whittle, a woman who takes testosterone and thinks she's a man. And Stephen Whittle is not a medical professional. She's a human rights lawyer or something, and this is the president of WPATH at the time. And from 2007, the rebrand onwards, it's purely political. They are on a quest to what is called de-psychopathologize transgender identities. That means all of a sudden, like the whole campaign is, this is a perfectly natural, healthy state of being. There's nothing, some people are just born trans. They just have this mismatched gender soul residing in their body, and there's nothing you can do. And it's actually really healthy and you should celebrate it, but it causes them terrible pain. So what you have to do is then give them hormones and surgeries as a human right. And anyone who says that maybe the hormones and surgeries aren't such a good idea, they're transphobic. That's bigotry, and they need to be silenced. And so I believe this entire medical scandal, while Your Nation is definitely what I consider to be ground zero, I do believe that WPATH is largely responsible for the free-for-all that we have now in gender clinics all over the world, where anyone who says they are transgender, no matter what age, can get access to hormones and surgeries. That's WPATH. That's how WPATH framed it. And I did look at this morning, the Netherlands has 30 members, 30 WPATH members. So there is a significant overlap with the Netherlands and WPATH. And then you have your own history of how you started this whole thing.
Yeah, there's, depending on how you look at it, an infamous role in the whole history that you just laid out from the perspective of WPATH for the Netherlands in particular, with transgenderism as a phenomena, and especially as, I think when it started, probably it was still pathologized and treated, and now it's called, with a euphemism perhaps, confirming an identity. And well, you have to do some medical treatment alongside the confirming, which is, you don't do medical treatments if you don't have a pathology normally. But okay, let's leave the jargon for what it is for a minute, so then you can probably detail why it is a pathology and what kind of treatment is necessary, if any at all. but the Netherlands does have this university that plays a certain role. Maybe you can, for our Dutch audience, because probably most of the people who are going to watch and listen to this are going to be Dutch. And I don't think a lot of them know what the history actually is. And so you touched on the very early transgender people that became famous. I think another famous case is John Money. Before we started recording, we shortly talked about it. That there's this connection between transgenderism and the Netherlands. Maybe you could give us a short oversight from what you learned about this.
There's a lot I can say. So, like I said, first wave is Germany, 1920s, 1930s, but really wave two, I would say, begins in the Netherlands, or, well, Christine Jurgensen, Denmark, 1950s, but then the Netherlands, you're a very progressive nation. You pride yourselves on being a very progressive, inclusive, tolerant nation. And so it makes sense to me that this is where it all began, because you were way ahead of the curve. And so in the 1970s, I have Free University Medical Center in Amsterdam. It's VU Medical Center. I don't know what the... Okay. So in the 1970s, this is where it's all happening. And the surgeons and the ethics boards within that hospital did have a hard time, because people recognized that you were cutting into a healthy body. You were performing these really invasive medical treatments on healthy bodies, and that was an ethical issue. But one of the leading plastic surgeons there, and this is a Christian university, right? One of the leading plastic surgeons there, he argued before the ethics board basically that from a Christian point of view, the soul or the psyche is more important than the body, and you cannot change the soul or the psyche, so therefore it's ethical to change the body. And that's how they rationalized it from a Christian perspective, that these individuals have this soul, this wrong sex gender soul residing within their body. And so therefore they felt that it was the humane thing to do to operate in the most barbaric way these really health destroying surgeries. Now, bring me back to my point, because I may go off on a tangent now, but I always wonder, because in the 1970s, we didn't actually really understand what was motivating largely men who thought they were women and wished to medically alter their bodies. But there were women who wished to be men, and their motivation was much clearer, I think, because they were largely homosexual, gender nonconforming, lesbian women, and they wished to escape the homophobia in the world and live as men. Their motivation was much easier to understand. But for the men, nobody really got that it was mostly a paraphilic desire. This is basically a fetish. Ray Blanchard came up with it he coined the term autogynephilia in 1989, but in the Netherlands in the 1970s, we had no idea that these men were largely aroused by the thought and fantasy of becoming women. It was a sexual fetish. And I do wonder what this plastic surgeon in the Amsterdam Christian University Hospital, would he still have framed it in a Christian way of, it's very compassionate to help these people who have these wrong sex souls? Would he have gone there if he'd known that it was a paraphilic desire, that it was an erotic desire? I think quite likely not. But because there was no understanding at the time, it begins here, and it becomes... Once you let the genie out of the bottle and stories start to spread around that there are these doctors, these surgeons doing this in an Amsterdam clinic, then you're going to get all of those men who have a very powerful erotic drive they're desperate to embody the object of their own desire. They are desperate to become women. Then they start to flood the hospitals in the US, hospitals all over the world, begging for the same surgical and hormonal interventions. And then that's just basically, we're off. We've got an epidemic. But what I find really interesting about the Netherlands connection, the where it all started in your nation, is in 1988, a team of researchers published a paper that followed up that first wave of men, your 1970s wave of men. 15 years later, they follow them up and they publish a paper. And this is the most crucial part, I think. The men are not happy. And the reason I think it's worded in the paper, they're not happy because of a never disappearing masculine appearance. Basically, they're not happy because they still look like men. They don't look like women, and therefore their life is not any better. They're moving through the world. They look like men. They're not happy. And so someone has the idea, they looked at this failed experiment on these men, and they said, what we need to do is we need to intervene earlier. The reason the experiment has failed is because we're waiting too long. We need to start doing this to children. We need to start doing this to adolescents. And so someone came up with the idea that this experiment on adults has failed, so what we need to do is do it to kids. Now, I'm not saying that this person was technically an evil person. I'm sure there was no ill intent. But that's an evil idea, because that's, you know it's gone wrong. You know it's failed. So you think, oh, well, let's try and do it to kids instead. And then they thought, that they could create adults, males who look like women, and therefore they'd be happy. Yeah. It's a mad idea.
It's also going back to the Christian aspect and the sexualized aspect. It reminded me actually of Iran or Islamic countries where homosexual men are feminized because then it's not a problem. And
I've heard trans activists hold up Iran as like a wonderful place for trans rights. I'm like, are you mad? They basically give these homosexual men the choice of prison or execution or sex reassignment surgery. That's hardly a beacon of human rights.
Yeah, that's when there is like an element of faith and theology. It's very. I always try to compare it to different aspects of identity. So, if you're from a Christian standpoint, homosexuality is a sin. At least it used to be. There are now theological arguments that say it isn't, but let's not get into that. But basically, it's a sin for the longest time in Christianity. It's also a sin to gamble. Now, if you have a gambling addiction, would you call yourself a gambling Christian? But there are homosexual Christians. A while ago I heard about queer theology. So this identity-driven worldview is coming into view a lot when you're reading into these types of paraphilias or dysphoria. And it's very hard to not see the sexual aspect also, because I think identity and sexuality, as you can see with, gambling, it's a part of you. It's an addiction. It's inherent to yourself, like a smoker will always be a smoker, a drunkard will always be a drunkard. So there is a connection, but it's not like sexuality or orientation, as it's now called. And the rate of homosexuals being diagnosed with a dysphoria or I'm not even sure what the official jargon is these days in the medical field, but I think there's a very big overlap, and probably there's misdiagnoses because people just think, oh, I must be, the new thing is gender, so maybe I'm not homosexual, but I'm actually born in the wrong body, and all these things start to overlap and become very diffuse. The role of identity is very big in this, and how do you see that being used? Or because we're going to get into the WPATH Files, this is a bit of a bombshell that didn't really land for some reason in the Dutch press. So I think if we are going to make little cuts as a preview to this conversation, it's probably going to be from the WPATH Files, because there's examples of what this organization uses as sources and the types of things they discuss when they think nobody's listening. It's quite shocking. But this whole identity thing, before we get into the specifics, could you kind of give an oversight of how do you think this plays a role in all of this?
I think, to me, the main goal of modern trans activism is to disguise what's really driving people to identify as transgender. And so this whole transgender identity, the gender identities, and I identify as transgender, it's a disguise, it's a smokescreen for what's really going on underneath. And so this autogynephilia that I'm talking about, this paraphilia that drives most men to identify as women and seek hormones and surgeries, autogynephilic men deny the existence of autogynephilia. They deny it publicly, and a lot of the time they deny it to themselves as well. They just will not face up to the reality of their fetish. So instead, they just identify as transgender. And the way I see it is we have created a type of person called transgender. This happens all the time, like the social sciences, medicine, psychiatry. We have the ability to create new types of people, bring new types of people into being. So we now have this type of person called transgender, and the oversimplification is that a transgender person is somebody who has a gender identity that does not match their sexed body. That's an utterly absurd oversimplification. We've got John Money to thank for that. John Money popularized the concept of gender identity in the 1960s. And this idea that you can have, it's like a psychological sex that doesn't match your body. The reality is so much more complicated than that, okay? Like, if you look at all of the people who right now make sense of their lives through the label transgender. We have got the autogynephilic men that I keep talking about. We have got the homosexuals who are extremely gender nonconforming. And in this mad world where we have created the type of person transgender, these types of homosexuals can just select the label transgender, apply it to their life, and then they think that the answer to their problems is hormones and surgeries. Maybe some are happy after they go down that route. I'm not sure, but I still think it's a misguided medical treatment. But then you've also got, you see, we haven't really got to the mid-2010s yet, but in the 2010s, a social contagion started. And that's the most horrifying part of this story is used to be just autogynephilic men and gender nonconforming homosexuals, and then we got the social contagion, and that is the adolescents who are just going through adolescence. They are going through puberty and they dislike their secondary sex characteristics and they feel uncomfortable in their body. They take the label transgender because what does it even mean to be transgender? Like, look at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM. It's just a dislike of your secondary sex characteristics and a desire to be a member of the opposite sex. It's the most vague, imprecise diagnosis that means nothing at all, which means anyone can apply it to their lives if they choose to look at their life through the label of transgender, which is what all of these lost, confused kids are doing.
Especially girls, right?
They are
so the contagion it seems to be girls are especially susceptible to this. You rightfully said, like, we haven't gotten to this time period yet, and you got into a bit of a tangent. Then I went to Iran, but we were in Amsterdam at a Christian university. So if we step back from that, and then you can work your way towards this social contagion. So what happened after Amsterdam became this hub of new treatment, and it spread all over the world. You said, like, the hospitals were overflooded with people, especially men at first, wanting this treatment. And now we're into the social contagion. How would you situate it if we're going back to the timeline? Yeah.
Go back to the timeline. Okay, so back to Amsterdam, 1970s. At the same time that this is going on in Amsterdam in the 1970s, there is a parallel movement going on in the US that isn't going so well, because this is at Johns Hopkins. This is John Money with his infamous gender clinic where he experimented on the twins. There is a Netherlands connection. I do wish Yuri were here to give me the name of the person who worked with John Money in his clinic and then went back over to the Netherlands. But the name has escaped me right now. So John Money's clinic, Dr. Paul McHugh, he's the psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins at the time. He looks at what John Money and the gang are doing, and he looks at the outcomes for these men. They are not doing well. There's no improvement in their life. So he shuts down John Money's clinic. The Dutch, you over the other side of the Atlantic, you also look at the men in 1988, like I said. It's also a failure. These men are not doing well. So you have the idea to intervene earlier, and you have the idea to block the puberty of adolescents who believe themselves to be members of the opposite sex. Now, wave 2 is over in the US, and it falls out of favor, but the genie is out of the bottle. The trans activists are there, trans-identified people, they want this healthcare. They think it's a human right. They think it's their only route to happiness. So they're all forming the modern trans rights movement. It's the fledgling movement in its earliest stages in the US in the 1980s and 1990s. Over here in Europe, you've started doing it to adolescents. Now, the first case study, patient 0, was I think she was a 13-year-old girl, very masculine, gender nonconforming lesbian. Her father was not accepting of her homosexuality, was not accepting of her masculinity. She was terrified of puberty. She hated the development her body was going through. And so an endocrinologist decided to put her on puberty blockers. She then progressed to cross-sex hormones. She then had her breast cut off. And then she had a surgery on her genitals that wasn't quite the ghoulish horror show that is when they strip the forearm and they turn it into a penis-like shape and they sew it onto a woman's groin. It wasn't that, but it was somewhere like that. It was in between. And so she has all of this done, and basically we've got an endocrinologist and a psychologist. They are amazed that she looks like a boy. She looks like a man. And this is a huge success because she looks like a man. The whole thing is very superficial. It's all about appearance. Nobody seems to care about the health. Nobody seems to care about the impact on this person's ability to form intimate relationships or, the mental health or anything. It's just if we succeeded because this girl looks like a boy, that's the measure of success. But they follow her up for a number of years. And she basically, I think at age 35, they're following her up. And she says she doesn't regret it, but she has shame about her genital appearance. She's having a hard time forming intimate relationships, and she's a bit depressed. And so it's like, how was that even successful? But that then her one case, which was supposedly a success, which was not a success at all, makes it across the Atlantic and lands in the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And they include the recommendation to use puberty blockers in their Standards of Care 6, which came out in 2001, I think, based on one patient, a case study of one. And it wasn't even a success. They put it into their guidelines. And then the child medical transition experiment takes off. We have in Boston Children's Hospital, Norman Spack gets things going in 2006. They start their whole puberty suppression experiment. You guys have got the same thing going on. You're enrolling more and more young people into this puberty suppression experiment until we get to 2011, which is our pivotal moment. And that's when the first study in the what would become the Dutch protocol, which is the very foundation of the entire abominable crime that we have committed against young people. And so they enroll 111 participants and they give them puberty blockers, but only 70 of them make it into the actual study. This is a deeply flawed study, it's always been flawed, but the very foundation of it is deeply flawed. And then they have these really questionable results. They're really questionable measures, but they present it to the world as if it's real science and if it's solid science. And then in 2014, they follow them up. And they've all gone through cross-sex hormones and they've all had surgery. And they basically declare it a success. And then the rest of the world says, great, it's a huge success. Let's go. And they just unleash the experiment across the world. But there's a wonderful article, an academic article called The Myth of Reliable Research. If you read that article, it details just how methodologically flawed those two pivotal Dutch studies were. But there's a concept called runaway diffusion. And that's what happens. So runaway diffusion is when the medical world takes a small experiment, mistakes it for proven medical practice, and sends it out into widespread mainstream medicine. That's runaway diffusion. Runaway diffusion is what happened with those two Dutch experiments. They escaped the lab and they made it all over the world. And endocrinologists all over the world got swept up in the excitement of the whole experiment and blocked the puberty of goodness, we don't even know how many young people, interfered with their development based on nothing more than a transient, adolescent, fashionable political identity. And the implications of it are far reaching, because you can sterilize these children, you can impair their sexual function. Some of the boys will never have an orgasm because their penises will never develop, so they'll never be sexual beings. The girls that end up on testosterone, they end up with vaginal atrophy. The walls of the vagina dry and crack, so they also can't form sexual relationships. They have their breasts cut off. They'll never breastfeed children, even if they could have children. And they did all of this based on no science, not one shred of decent, good quality science to suggest that it was the right thing to do. And
this is also getting into the WPATH files. I think there's maybe first shortly explain what happened. You were part of an organization headed by Schellenberger, who is I knew him from environmental discussions. He was always a bit controversial and also a very interesting speaker. And then, I already referenced the bombshell, which was a leak of files, the WPATH files. Maybe you could give a fairly short overview of what was in them and how did you get a hold of them?
Well, I can't tell you how we got hold of them because I don't know. Yeah. Yes, it is. I started writing for Michael in April 2023, I think. Yeah. And shortly after, he hired me to write about gender. And then shortly after he hired me, somebody gave him the WPATH files. And it was a stack of leaked internal communications from WPATH's internal messaging forum. And what the beauty of it was, it's just the madness of WPATH on full display in their own words. And I wrote a report telling the story of WPATH, presenting the absolute insanity of this organization, using their own words as the framework. And we had everything in there, honestly. We had the simple things like, they absolutely know that these kids cannot possibly understand the lifelong implications of this treatment. We have doctors in there, endocrinologists, surgeons, talking about how, talking to kids about fertility preservation is like talking to a blank wall. All of the things that we see, they see, and they talk about it freely and openly. And then they're talking, of course, there's the harm of cross-sex hormones. You've got men on estrogen who have erections that feel like broken glass, and you've got women showing up in the emergency room with vaginal atrophy because the testosterone has dried the vaginal walls and they're bleeding because then they can't have sex. You've got all kinds of just horrific side effects. We plunge into one of the most egregious crimes, I would say. I think when a field of medicine has absolutely no respect for the Hippocratic Oath, no restraints, no ethical principles whatsoever, there is no limit to where you can plunge. And the WPATH files, the most absurd part is when they're talking about non-binary surgeries. I don't know if people in the Netherlands are aware of the fact that this even exists, but non-binary surgeries, they're talking about creating body types that don't exist in nature. So this is for people who identify as neither male nor female. These WPATH surgeons will create like a Ken doll type, like smooth, sexless body with no outward sign of sexual characteristics at all. Or perhaps even worse is for the people who identify as both male and female, because they get the surgical creation of a second set of genitals. So they're just like, if the man wants to keep his penis but also have a vagina because he thinks he's both male and female, they'll create a vagina out of a section of his colon. And so the beauty of the WPATH files was it was just so wide-ranging, and all of the madness of this medical crime was right there for me to write about. So I just sculpted it into a 70-page report. The world needs to understand what WPATH is, because I think this group sits at the very core of this medical scandal. And if you don't understand that WPATH is an extremist transactivist group with no respect for medical ethics whatsoever, then you can't really understand how horrific this scandal is. And WPATH files came out in March 2024, but then 2024 was a terrible year for WPATH, because in April 2024, England's CAS review came out, and that was a 4-year investigation into England's youth gender service at the Tavistock, the infamous Tavistock clinic that's now closed. And the CAS review had a whole section on WPATH about how basically it's like a citation cartel, like circular citations where WPATH Standards of Care 6 comes out and it's based on no science, and then the Endocrine Society, they write guidelines based on WPATH Standards of Care 6, still no science, nothing resembling science. WPATH Standards of Care 7 then comes out, and they're all citing each other, but there's no science in the middle. But then from WPATH Standards of Care 7 in 2012, the rest of the world then takes that Standards of Care 7 as if it's real science, bases their own guidelines on it, and then we have an international medical scandal. And then the icing on the cake is WPATH Standards of Care 8 comes out in 2022, and they cite all of those other international guidelines as proof that this is a legitimate medical treatment. But it's all at the center lies an empty shell of just deranged madness and no science. And then that's not even the worst of it for WPATH. Then in, I think it was June 2024, July, we got unsealed documents in an Alabama legal challenge. So Alabama banned gender affirming, so-called, it's not gender affirming at all, banned this medical experiment on children. And the ACLU launched a lawsuit, a legal challenge. And so Alabama did discovery. They basically forced WPATH to hand over 2 million emails, I think, on how Standards of Care 8, that utterly bonkers document in 2022, how they drew up Standards of Care 8. And it's completely mad. We've only seen a tiny snippet so far, but they basically, Admiral Rachel Levine, who was Biden's Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services. Okay, yeah, just so people really visualize who I'm talking about here. So he basically, something mad happened in September 2022 with Standards of Care 8. You have got, there's a link to the Netherlands here, Annelou de Vries. She was one of the authors of the adolescent chapter, how to treat adolescents who are going through this. And something very strange happened because the Standards of Care 8 was published, and the adolescent chapter contained lower age limits. And then about 2 days later, they removed those lower age limits. And they weren't very good, to be honest. I think you could get a mastectomy, a bilateral mastectomy at age 14. But all of a sudden, all of the lower age limits just disappear from the document. The official story WPATH gave was, oh, we published the wrong one, as if that's possible. We published the wrong one. That was their official story. With these discovery emails, we find out that Rachel Levine is the one pressuring WPATH, saying, you got to get rid of these lower age limits because it's going to hurt these legal challenges that are happening. Basically, get rid of the lower ages because it's going to hurt the Biden administration's political agenda. And WPATH did it. They just took them out because Rachel Levine told them to. Rachel Levine, I would bet everything I own on him being an autogynephilic man. He came out as a woman after he had been married for many years, fathered children, and you know, now advocates for children to be sterilized. You know, this is not an individual that you want setting any guidelines or having any influence on how children are treated medically. He is a pediatrician as well, which is a bit ironic. The other things that came out in there, they consulted social justice lawyers. They're always like, there's a lot of evidence in there that they were constantly, it's political. I mean, we knew that. We all know that it's a trans activist group masquerading as a medical group, setting the standards of care for an international field of medicine. But the emails show that this is a political group. They commissioned 13 systematic reviews upon which to base the Standards of Care 8. The first 2 came out. They didn't show anything like what they wanted them to show. They just basically showed there's no evidence. It's all terrible. So we've never seen the other 11. They just buried them. They just prevented them from being published because that's how these things work. If the evidence doesn't say what you want it to say, just bury it.
It's a theme you see with paid for science a lot. And the political aspect is also interesting. Right now we have Trump, who just at the time of recording yesterday, he banned all trans athletes from competing in the US. Which is
well, that can I just correct that? Not strictly true. He banned male athletes from competing in female categories. If you are trans identified, you can still be an athlete and you can still compete. You just have to compete in reality, not in gender la la land.
That's a very important nuance, actually. This is part of a wider, in his inauguration speech, he was talking about from now on, men and women is the only distinction. There's no genders. It's just the sexes as it used to be. There's a biological reality basically, and it's interesting that there's this very fast transition from having this Levine person with this. It's actually very powerful normative power that is bestowed onto people with a clear ideological agenda, which shouldn't be political. Yeah, we had a bit of a connection issue. Good to have you back. I was going to say that the Levine person we had just talked about is somebody who has a lot of normative power bestowed upon them, and it's clear that they have an ideological and political agenda. You illustrated how that is being played out in institutionally powerful organizations such as WPATH, which is basically an advisory board on a lot of, and as you mentioned also, it's part of the circle of self-referential studies and arguments that are being made to get probably to get money, but also so it's not just funding, but also to get journalists to write favorably about the surgeries that are being performed. But these political actors have a lot of power, normative power, and now suddenly it's all going in the other direction. I remember hearing an endocrinologist talk about he was attending a session for. It was he was saying like we only have a couple of conferences that are being attended by endocrinologists because it's a fairly small field. And there was somebody talking about transgenderism, and there were normative claims being made that were absolutely insane. And he was like, wait, and his neighbor was like, okay, yeah, this is normal, and everybody was kind of just like, okay, yeah, this is how things are now, and suddenly it was like that. And he was flabbergasted, like, wait, this is not normal, this is gonna interrupt with the, he knew it was correlating with a lot of bad health outcomes. The treatments that were being proposed, he was like, no, this can't be true. But everybody was just like, yeah, no, this is normal. This is how it is now. And there's just a very strange. We're talking about this contagion that is, I think, affecting mostly girls. I think there was this period on Tumblr. I don't think Zoomers even know what Tumblr is, but this was like a thing for millennial girls who were chronically online, and they were infected with this gender virus, maybe we could say. So there's different aspects to this. One is institutional and normative, and the other is like meme and just social pressure. I think that's maybe why girls are more susceptible. I have a son and a daughter, and the social is very important for the girls, and objects and being busy with sports and things like that is more, it's typical, but there is, for me, the N is one, it's true, and now the political is completely shifted. Do you think the contagion of Trump and this new wave is going to set forth and change everything, or how does the future look?
So the Americans, I live in Canada, watching the progress that Americans are making is sort of painful, I have to say, because I'm happy for them, but the situation is the opposite here. We're making no progress. And I would say every bit of sanity that returns to the US pushes us further into insanity because of this. Canadians, they need to see themselves as being better than Donald Trump. We're better than those bigots down there. So we're going to be even more crazy on this whole gender issue. So the battle, even for Americans, the battle is not won. And that is because, as you said, there are so many angles to it. On the one side, the medical associations, the major medical institutions, they all have to change course on this. The American medical institutions like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, American Medical Association, they all fell for WPATH's stunt, and they all have to change course. But think about how hard that is for an institution, a massive institution that for over a decade has been pushing a terrible medical crime against children, how difficult that is to say, sorry, we got it wrong. We believed those weird deranged cultists over there, and we got it wrong, and we harmed a lot of kids. It's going to be really hard for them to change course and turn it around. Then you've got, like we were talking about, this is a civil rights movement that has never been, like the likes of which have never been seen before, in that it wasn't grassroots, a tiny little, group of people fighting for equality and an end to discrimination. It was a behind the scenes, organized, all out assault on reality that launched in around the 2010s. Just all of a sudden, we were told that what makes you a man, woman, boy, or a girl is this internal gender soul and not your body. And they rewrote what it meant to be human, and they thrust it upon us. And like you're saying, these endocrinologists, they're like, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem right, but this is how we do things now. That's because the trans rights movement was so well coordinated behind the scenes and so well funded that they were able to thrust this new reality on everyone. And then most crucially, they were able to ruin anyone who disagreed. If you even question this, you're a transphobe and you lose everything. It will destroy you. They publicly destroyed enough people to send the message that nobody is allowed to question this. And so it's because of the power of trans activism, they captured the education system, they captured the medical system, they captured the legal system, they captured every major institution in society. That's not just going to go away because Trump signed a few executive orders that don't even really have that much power. The executive order can't change laws. And so even the Americans have got a very, very messy road ahead. There's already the ACLU have already launched a legal challenge against Trump's ban on gender-affirming, so-called gender-affirming medicine. And then you've got the culture. So we have got a couple of generations, or at least an entire generation, that have grown up in this alternate reality. And they have learned that what makes them a man, woman, boy, or girl is their gender identity, that some people can change sex, that puberty blockers are a perfectly natural, reversible pause. And they've grown up in this world and they don't know any other world. To them, it all seems very real. You can't just erase that. You can't just, I see an entire generation as being brainwashed by a cult. And you can't just pull them out of the cult because Donald Trump has restored reality to the federal government in the US. It is going to take years, perhaps decades, to rid society of this absolute poisonous ideology that we have allowed to infect every institution and every level of society. And so I do think that the contagion you see, the social media aspect, you're absolutely right. It started on Tumblr, and it was very much contained to Tumblr because it was only a certain type of kid that was on Tumblr. And so the contagion began there. But when it burst out onto YouTube, Instagram, TikTok is the absolute worst of them all, because you've got thousands upon thousands of teenage girls prancing around, showing off their mastectomy scars, doing shots of testosterone, extolling the joy of medical transition. Look how happy I am. Life is wonderful. And they're just like, it's a virus. It's spreading. It's a super spreading environment on TikTok. That eventually will naturally wane, I suppose, but I mean, it's showing no sign, as far as I can tell. Trans TikTok is as active as ever. We let these kids be sucked into a body mutilation cult, and now we're going to be dealing with the fallout of that for a very long time. But I do think, if we can restore reality, every effort to restore reality is in some way going to slow the spread and gradually shift us back. But I don't even know if we'll ever be rid of it. Will we ever be rid? I think we need to be rid of the concept of the transgender person. We actually need to throw that away. It doesn't, there's nothing good comes from that. And then we need to look at, who are these people and why are they seeking hormonal and surgical medical intervention? They're not transgender. What's motivating them? And then we can really help them.
With the social contagion aspect, I always try to, if you rationalize it, I think it's almost like a cult, the love bombing, if you come out, it's like, there's so much, the whole jargon of affirmation is also, I think, is probably like, it's jargon that could be cultish if you look at it in a different way. With Trump, I think there's also this, you almost wonder, like, is it maybe even counterproductive in a way that because it's Trump, it's going to be like pushed back on extra hard, and it's not like it becomes suspicious, if I think, and that's why we were already on a roll. If you were looking at it from a perspective from, like you were saying, you were talking about 2024, this was before the inauguration. People were already coming to terms, from Sweden, France, the UK with the bombshell of the class report. It was already changing, and now you have this populist almost claiming it. Is there a danger in that, do you think?
I think not for you so much. I do think Europe, you're well past your tipping point. On the medical scandal, certainly the adolescent medical scandal, you are well past the tipping point, and you're in the dying days of this scandal now. I just think you can't undo the Cass report, Sweden, Finland, even the Netherlands. You've launched some sort of inquiry as well. There's only one outcome. When a nation looks at this, really examines this medical treatment and the affirmation model of care, there's only one outcome. You can only stop doing it, okay? In the US and Canada, we just do the ostrich with the head in the sand. We're not looking at it because we're not interested in the evidence. It's purely ideological, and we are guided by trans activists. So it's impossible. It's impossible for me to know what impact Trump will have. I will say, because I'm over here and I've been in this debate publicly for so long, I do feel an absolutely enormous shift of the tides, and it feels as though it doesn't matter whether you dislike Trump, or it doesn't matter how hard the Democrats fight, how hard the ACLU pushes to have these kids served up for this medical scandal. I do think that there's been such an enormous shift of public opinion that it can only go in one direction, and that is eventually the medical scandal will end. Whether we'll ever be free of this concept of transgender people, I do not know. And I do fear a pendulum swing too far in the opposite direction. I always have feared that, in that certainly for the LGB, because they wedded the LGB to the T, and the trans movement has been such a fiasco, just such an absolute catastrophe for anyone who believes themselves to be transgender. It has destroyed their reputation, and I don't think that will ever be restored. But I fear that they're dragging the LGB down as well, and that they're giving anyone who wishes. Homophobia never disappeared. Gay rights was massively successful, but there's still homophobia in the world. And I do fear that because the T was stuck to the LGB, now they're just going to pull them down, and we're going to have a shift back to people being actually openly homophobic and feeling like they can be. Like, I've seen people calling for, like, blaming the LGB for this and calling for a rollback of gay rights. I mean, I don't want to go in that direction. I just want people to stop chopping healthy body parts off innocent young teenagers and young adults. It's
the danger of pathologizing an orientation again. Basically, is what's at stake.
Yeah, I mean, the trans rights modeled itself on gay rights, because one of the biggest wins of gay rights was getting, in 1973, getting homosexuality taken out of the DSM. And so that was a huge win. And so trans rights decides to just do the same thing, de-psychopathologize. But it's incredible. I mean, I don't even know how they thought they could get away with it, because obviously being gay does not require having body parts chopped off. It doesn't require becoming a lifelong medical patient. It doesn't require anything of society. It's like, so two men want to get married. Who cares? It doesn't affect anyone. But trans is the opposite. Like, they de-psychopathologized something that requires lifelong medical intervention. It's somehow a perfectly natural, healthy state of being that just so happens to require lifelong medical intervention and the amputation of healthy body parts. And yet that's the route that they chose to go down. And then because they made it look like gay rights, I think that's a huge part of why we allowed it to happen, is because gay rights had just happened, and we're in the post-gay rights world. And with hindsight, you can look back, and there were clear good guys and bad guys in the gay rights fight. Those who supported gay rights are the good guys, and those who could not accept homosexual people for who they were, those are the bad guys, those are the homophobes. And so because trans rights launched in the post-gay rights era, modeled itself precisely after gay rights, made itself look exactly like gay rights, even though it's in direct contradiction most of the time with gay rights. It's deeply homophobic. Most people, they just thought, okay, I have to support this. It looks like gay rights. I'm a good person. Good people supported gay rights. So now I need to support this. And they ended up supporting something that was horrifically evil and actually very homophobic.
Well, Mia, I think it's, when I hear your answers, I immediately start associating different aspects, and we're just barely scratching the surface, which is, it's very good that you published the WPATH Files, and I really recommend people to, our audience is Dutch, but most of the Dutch people are pretty familiar with English, and you have a great Twitter. I think that's where it all started for you with this journey. You're a senior fellow at an institute which I tried to pronounce a couple of times, which didn't really go well, which you can do right now.
It's the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. So it's named after two of Canada's first prime ministers, Sir John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier. I don't know my Canadian history very well. I'm Brit, so please excuse me. But one of them was right wing, one of them was left wing. One was conservative, one was liberal. And the idea is that this is the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is neutral and just criticizes bad federal policy and promotes better policy.
That's and I think it's really interesting. The first article you published there was the public policy echo chamber, which I read, which is very interesting. And then you kind of did a call to Canada, and I already get the feeling that you're less optimistic about Canada right now. Maybe the new government, if Canada chooses another name, it's going to be hard to pronounce, the right-wing populist candidate called
Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre.
So you wanted to respond, sorry.
Well, for Canada, we will get there. My thing has been, I've been studying medical scandals for many years now, just to make sense of this one. If you study past medical scandals, you can see a lot of like common patterns that run through them all. And one thing is they always end, right? Especially when one is such an egregious crime like this one, it definitely, even in Canada, will come to an end. If it weren't for the militant trans activists and the ideological nature of it, it would have come to an end a long time ago. And so under Trudeau, we bow down to trans activists and we do whatever they say and we never question anything and we're just absolute cowards. Poilievre, I do hope, would have more courage to stand up to them. However, our medical institutions and our gender clinics are overrun with WPATH members, and we are entirely guided by ideology. And therefore, the government can step in, like Alberta has banned puberty blockers and stepped in, and then there's the legal challenge, and there's this back and forth.
And then the experts are called.
And there's so... The WPATH experts, I mean, can I just go back to WPATH for 1 minute? Because the WPATH experts, there's always Dr. Daniel Metzger, who's at the BC Children's Hospital, endocrinologist, brought puberty blockers to Canada right when you guys started doing it. In the 1990s, this man brings it to Canada. And so they talk to him, and he's there saying this is evidence-based and WPATH is the best. And then he's the star of WPATH Files because he's the one on the inside talking to a 14-year-old about fertility preservation is like talking to a blank wall. He's the one who sees that these kids have regret because he sees it in his own patients. They come back to him when they're in their 20s and they've met someone and they want to settle down. And his famous line in WPATH Files is, he says to them, "Oh, the dog's not doing it for you anymore, is it?" Meaning when he sterilized them when they were teenagers, they thought they'd always be happy with a dog because they were teenagers and teenagers can't understand these things. And then they go back to him in their 20s and they want to have kids and they regret the fact that he sterilized them. And he says, "Oh, the dog's not doing it for you anymore, is it?" But that's the expert that the Canadian media turn to promote this absolute medical crime. So we have got the role of the media is vitally important. I'm working on a piece for the Macdonald-Laurier about this right now, and I have been reading Canada's coverage of this medical scandal all the way back to 2011 was when they first started writing about it. And it fills me with something like a murderous rage to see how our mainstream media has just promoted only one side. They only ever talk to the experts on one side. They only ever talk to trans activists. They vilify people like me and anyone who suggests that this is the wrong thing to do. So not only does our medical institutions, they have to rid themselves of the activists, our media needs to stand up and say, hey, we got this wrong. Really sorry about that. We reported on something completely full of misinformation. We talked to trans activists. We believed them when we shouldn't have. They've got to come out and say we got it wrong. Our governments have all got to admit that they turned a blind eye to the harm. We have gender identity, this totally made up concept that doesn't even exist. We have that written into law. People are protected. Gender identity is protected in law when it doesn't even exist. We have to get that taken out. Honestly, I can't even see the end. I know it will end, but I can't even see it yet. We're so far.
It's interesting with the media. We had pretty famous Dutch journalist in our studio, and a colleague of mine was having a conversation, and they were talking about America, and somehow transgenderism came up, and he was a mainstream media personality, and he was sure of it that 99% of the transitioned transgenders were happy with their surgery.
You know, let me just say something about that. So there's 2 points there. First of all, if you do precisely zero follow-up, you can easily have a 0% regret rate. If you just don't bother following up, you chop the body parts off, you sterilize them, and then you just send them out into the world and you don't follow up. 0% regret rate because you haven't followed anyone up. But the 1% regret comes from a paper. Well, it comes from a systematic review of all of the studies of regret rates. And they found that less than 1% regret. This paper, the field of gender affirming, so-called gender affirming medicine, is absolutely renowned for appallingly garbage junk science. It is an entire field of research that is just mountains and mountains of junk science. And that review that he was undoubtedly quoting, the less than 1% regret, sits at the top of the mountain. That is probably the very worst, shoddiest piece of research done in a field renowned for absolute garbage. They accidentally added thousands of participants that don't even exist. Somebody did an analysis of it on one table, just one table in the review. There were 50 errors in one table, and they have been told time and time again what's wrong with it and why there are errors, and they refuse to correct it, which leaves you, one researcher who gets really upset about this paper said, where's the line between incompetence and fraud? Because that to me is fraudulent. You've had the mistakes pointed out to you. Sure, you were incompetent at first. You absolutely, completely incompetent, but now you have refused to correct them. That's fraud. But the very idea that less than 1% of people would regret having an arm flesh appendage sewn onto their groin that has astronomical rates of complications is absurd. There's a psychological angle to it as well that I think is really important. Is most of these regret studies are self-report. These people bear in mind that they had healthy bodies, and then they decided that they needed body parts chopped off, they needed to be castrated, they needed an arm flesh appendage sewn onto their groin, or they needed to have their penis amputated because they thought it would make them happy. And it's a one-way street. You go down that road, you get to the end, and it's not made you happy. You are going to be very psychologically motivated to keep telling yourself, I don't regret this, I don't regret this, I don't regret it. Because otherwise, what the detransitioners talk about this all the time, the hardest thing to do was to admit to themselves that they regretted it. You have to then admit that the whole thing was in vain, that you got it wrong, that you sacrificed your healthy body for nothing. It hasn't made you happier. In fact, it's probably made you less happy because now you're really unhealthy and you have all these medical complications. But there's a very powerful motivation to deny, self-denial. It's self-deception. You just have to keep telling yourself you're happy. So all of these regret studies that are based on self-report, they cannot be trusted because these people are not likely to admit that it was all for nothing.
Yeah, I think this cathartic moment that all of Western society needs to go through, and which you were just saying, like, I'm not seeing it right now, but I know eventually we'll have to go through. Maybe there is something in this denial that once it sets in, and once you have testimony of people who eventually do come out of the closet again, but this time saying, I made a huge mistake, and there's already testimony coming in, and at some point there will be a convergence of attention, because that's the thing. The mainstream media will keep ignoring it until there's no more ignoring it, and then this cathartic moment will come, and it will probably be through these people and their pain and the way they can testify of their pain and their regret, and then we will see and collectively shake our heads, like, how did this happen? Just like with all the other medical well, I mean, it's, if you compare two things, you have to go to barbaric times, in my opinion, which is, I know people that are struggling with gender identity, and I love them. So it's a hard thing to say, compare it to barbaric times, but I think there is something to this, like you graphically give the example of the well, let's not get into too much detail for YouTube's sake, but yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, we always go to lobotomies because lobotomies obviously was a barbaric crime. The thing about lobotomies is nobody banned lobotomies, right? Still legal. If you want a lobotomy, it's still legal in most places. You can still have one. You just need to find a medical professional willing to do it. And that's where we need to get to with this. It's maybe not banning it. Banning it's not necessarily, I don't believe banning it is the answer. I believe the medical profession needs to realize that this is not medicine. Creating arm flesh appendages and sewing it onto a mentally ill woman's groin is not helping her, and therefore it's not medicine. Destroying people's health with cross-sex hormones that their bodies aren't designed to cope with, that come with cancer, stroke, heart disease, all sorts of complications, that's not medicine. And especially if you're doing it so that the person can then go on to live a lie for the rest of their lives, I don't think you're helping anyone. So we just need an enormous shift. We can have compassion for people who struggle with their gender, because these people do exist, and they exist in much larger numbers because of the relentless messaging of the modern trans rights movement that we thrust upon people. You can have compassion for people, but to me, the compassionate way is to help them reconcile with their body. It's always better to avert destroying your health. It's always better to avert the need for lifelong medical intervention. And I think it's usually, if you embark on medical transition, you're probably embarking upon it with very unrealistic expectations. If you think that, having your penis amputated is going to make your life better, you're probably wrong. It's probably not going to make your life better, because you'll end up with an open wound that you actually have to dilate for the rest of your life. Your whole endocrine system, once you're castrated, your whole endocrine system is destroyed, and then you're reliant on hormones, synthetic hormones, for the rest of your life. These are things that are not going to actually improve your life. They're destroying your health. And I think as adults, we all understand that health is one of the most important things in your life. Like get any diagnosis and you'll soon realize the value of health. And so the fact that we as adults are doing so little to protect young people, we're the ones who understand the importance of health. Remember what it was like when you were a teenager? You didn't care. You'd do any kind of crazy stuff because it didn't matter that it was going to affect your future. Like, you didn't want to even live to be 40. Like, you felt immortal. and health was of no concern whatsoever. But as you age, you gradually realize, oh my goodness, it's actually really important, and I should do everything I can to preserve it. We're allowing these young people to sacrifice their health when they don't have any idea what that means. And so we can be compassionate. The real compassion is helping these people reconcile with their body. The real compassion is telling them, no, you are not transgender, because there's no such thing. You think you are a member of the opposite sex, either because you're going through puberty and you're having a hard time, you're autistic and you don't really fit in with your peers and you're fixated on this idea. You have autogynephilia, you have a paraphilia, and you want to embody the object of your own desire. You're gay and you're not really, you want to escape your homosexuality. Really look at what these people have. Really look at why they think hormones and surgeries are the answer, and try and help them be happy and healthy and living in the body that they have, because you only get one.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you very much for this powerful statement at the end. We scheduled an hour, but I think, like I said before, it's just you can have a lot of philosophical points of view on the things we're touching on right now, but I think the compassion is very important, especially like you said, the pendulum shouldn't shift the other way. We need to, if you're gay, that's fine, let's not medicalize things that aren't supposed to be medicalized. If you want to boil it down to a really simple short sentence. And I think you have a very powerful way of talking about it, so thank you very much. And I hope people, because that's where I was going with the outro, talking about what you're doing and where they can find you. We will put all the links in the description, and so they can follow you. And I think there will be a lot of things coming in the future that are going to be of interest for people that follow this subject. And I think it's much more than just this, the medicalization of one of gender or sex. Actually, it's not gender but sex, it's political, it's cultural, it's about orientation, it's also about family and children and the times we live in. So I thank you for documenting it and being a voice for a lot of people that might have regret, and being one of the, because I know it's not always easy to speak out and you get a lot of things thrown at you for saying what I think is the truth. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Aan de kijkers, bedankt voor het kijken en tot de volgende keer en dan weer in het Nederlands.